Okay, as we get started today, I've already had several questions about how long this is going to take, so we're going to roll through this as well as we can. On Monday, just to be 100% clear on this, Macklin Tower 205, it's the exact same room that we had the first exam in from 8:30 until 1:15. 8:30, 1:15. Basically, you have to go up into the library and go upstairs in the library to get there. If you want to take it when it's your normal class time, that's fine. I would encourage everybody and anybody to come in a little bit early. That way, there are usually fewer people there earlier. You don't have to worry about getting a seat, because if there aren't seats, then you kind of have to sit on the floor until somebody leaves. With that being said, it's going to be on everything that you see up here. So chapter 11, chapter 5, there are a couple of terms from chapter 3. Some of you are going to have the belief quiz because you didn't have the belief quiz on the first exam. And then there's also going to be some terms from the Electoral College. Basically the same format, probably 5 out of 8 short answer questions, and then probably 35-ish multiple choices. So it's going to be about a 95 or 100-point exam. If you start writing on the short answers, and I'm going to say it right now to make sure that you know, if you only write 2 or 3 sentences, it's not going to be enough. So really explain it. Give me details. Give me both sides of the argument. For the multiple choices, break it down into chapter questions, the terms, and then also the articles. And a lot of people struggled with the chapter questions from the first exam. So please take a look at those chapter questions, because they're oftentimes very easy questions as long as you actually looked them up. And a lot of people lost 2 letter grades that way. There is about a 10-point curve for all the classes. There's usually a curve on the second exam, but it's not as much, so don't bank on that curve. What questions do y'all have about anything? And I'll go ahead and pull up civil rights to get this started, but there are 2 terms, and I'll make sure that these are posted in, I'll make sure that these are actually posted in Blackboard from chapter 3. One of them is going to be the tax and spend power, and the other one is going to be privileges and immunities. We went over these the last day before the last exam, but we had already done the review session. Do y'all remember what the tax and spend power was, or the example of tax and spend? Uh-oh. If you remember from the federalism chapter, in order for the government to pass a bill, you got to have a power somewhere in the Constitution. Commerce power was on the first exam. Full faith and credit clause was on the first exam. Tax and spend power dealt with the drinking age. Do you remember anything about the drinking age? Is there a national drinking age?
No.
There is not. How did this drinking age get set at 21? What did the federal government do?
You can set it lower, but you lose your highway funding from the government.
Federal government conditioned highway funding based on the drinking age. So all states are guaranteed X amount of dollars depending upon how many drivers they have, how many roads they have. So you might be a big state with a lot of roads and not a lot of people. You might be a small state with a lot of drivers but not a lot of roads. Or you could be California with a lot of both.
That was to make it constitutional. It has to give something to the state. They can't take away from the state.
Right. The idea was they said if you would raise your drinking age to 21, then in fact we would add 5% extra of highway funds. It was basically, according to some people, a bribe. And to some people, this was actually kind of considered blackmail. The government said, listen, we're spending our money. We have the right to put conditions on it. So if you want this extra free money, then you know what? You need to do what we say. There were states out there that said, look, this is really like blackmail. You know we can't turn down this money. Politically, it would be awful, but you're infringing upon state powers when you do this, and this is going too far. Supreme Court took a look at this, and they said, this is an incentive, and the government is putting basically attachments to dollars. If you want these dollars, then you've got to follow what their instructions or follow these attachments that they've added. They said it was perfectly legal. With that being said, and Isaiah, to your point, they also said in this, if they said it would be X, not X plus 5%, but X minus 5% if you did not agree to this, then at that point they said that this would not have been legal, and that would have been blackmail. But as long as you were adding, it was perfectly fine. Go ahead.
So that was an example of tax and spend?
That was an example of tax and spend. Do you remember what privileges and immunities dealt with? It was the very last thing from the federalism chapter. Unemployment benefits.
Oh, is that like when you
certain state has like unemployment, whatever. Like you can't like move over and then like transfer it, or you can, but like.
That was the case. The guy in South Carolina that lost his job and it was low benefits, but it was a low cost of living state,
Right.
and he wanted to move up to Connecticut.
Right.
Could he get benefits on the first day?
He could not.
No, you have to be living there.
Yes, he could. He could get unemployment benefits on the first day. Privileges and immunities is basically the idea that you have certain privileges and immunities as an American citizen. You have the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. You have the right to, I guess, basically to use the navigable waterways. You have a right to travel. And the Supreme Court, when they heard this case, the Connecticut governor was like, look it, man, if people just come here and they can get benefits on day one, you're screwing over my taxpayers because these new people coming here have never paid into our system. The Supreme Court said, wait a minute. The Supreme Court said, if you do not allow him to get benefits on day one, then in fact, guess what? You're actually denying him his right or his ability to travel. And so they said, yes, you can in this instance. Now, we talked about this like within the context of out-of-state tuition. You've got to live there for a while before you get out-of-state tuition. I guess college is a little bit different because it's not as life and death for somebody that might be dependent upon unemployment benefits, but that's not legal. Pardon me. College tuition on the first day is not legal in-state, but getting the unemployment benefits is legal. And it doesn't matter if you move from a low benefit state to a high benefit state. It doesn't matter if you move from a high benefit state to a low cost of living state like I did. Either way, it would be allowed. So that's all that I need from that chapter. You'll notice up here, we got some terms from chapter 5. And I'll go ahead and jump into civil rights and we'll get rolling with this. Have y'all got any questions about any of the terms from chapter 5?
Logos.
Don't worry about logos. Yeah, don't worry about logos. But anything from the terms down here.
Invidious discrimination.
Anybody remember what invidious discrimination was?
Is it like harmful discrimination?
Well, I guess you could say maybe harmful discrimination, but maybe all discrimination could be harmful at some level. Anybody with anything at all about invidious discrimination? This was a quickie that we dealt with at the very, very end up here, and you'll see it up here in this. Invidious discrimination, and let me just give this to you and make sure that this is clear. It is legal to discriminate in the United States. It is legal to discriminate in the United States. However, you've got to have kind of a logical reason in order to be able to do so. If the driving age is 16, or the voting age is 18, or the drinking age is 21, at some level, these are all examples of discrimination. But the idea, I guess, is that if people start driving much sooner than 16, then they're not going to be safe on the roads. If somebody is allowed to vote much earlier than 18, then maybe they're not going to be politically mature enough to be able to make the decision. Or maybe they might not just simply be, socially mature enough to drink much sooner than 21. If you ever go to an amusement park and it says, you've got to be at least this tall to ride this ride, that is discrimination, but it's perfectly legal because if you're not tall enough, you might get thrown out of the roller coaster and killed. I mean, it kind of makes sense that that's not bad discrimination in that regard. Invidious discrimination is when there's not a justification behind it. I am not going to hire somebody for a job because they're a woman, or somebody isn't capable because they have blonde hair, or short people, blah, blah, blah. You get the idea. So invidious discrimination is when there's not really any justification, but you're just discriminating against somebody because that's not legal. However, 16, 18, 21, or you must be this tall to ride this ride, those are all examples of discrimination that are perfectly accepted, but it's because there is a reason that works behind it. A reason that works. What else have you got from this chapter?
Plessy versus Ferguson.
What was the case of Plessy versus Ferguson?
That was the train ride, wasn't it?
It was the train ride. Homer Plessy, what do you know about
He was
him?
1/8
He was
black.
mixed. He was mixed black and white. And apparently he was trying to get into
He's zooming in. Be
he was
careful,
trying to
Aaron.
get into the train where the white people are, and they said, no, you can't do that because you're part black, so you have to ride with the black people.
Okay, let me pull back on this.
But he was like really, he looked very, very, very white.
He was a very light-skinned black man, and I've got three pieces on this. So, Aaron, let me start with yours. This was actually down in Louisiana, and this dealt with riding a train car. They had segregated, so they had whites only and coloreds only train cars down in Louisiana. And Homer Plessy decided that he wanted to challenge this. Beyond, it may have gotten overshadowed, but I heard what you said. What was the ratio in Homer Plessy?
He was 1/8 black.
Yeah, he was 1/8 black. So basically, if a couple that includes one person that is black and one person that's white has a child, that's basically 50-50 or 1/2. And then this child then has a child with somebody else that's black, or sorry, white. Now the ratio is 1/4 black. And then, in fact, if you go down further and you have another child with another white person, then in fact this is now 1/8. So we're not talking about your parent or your grandparent, but we're actually talking about your great-grandparent. One would have been white and one would have been black. So this is several generations removed. Very light-skinned black man. Bought a ticket on the whites-only car. Did he try and hide this?
Didn't he say that he was?
Go ahead.
Yeah, he said he was 1/8 black.
Well, I don't know that he gave the actual percentage. That's the way that the law recognized it, and I don't know exactly how they came up with that, but he did go to the police officers. He did go to the people, and he's like, listen, I'm considered black, but I'm going to buy this ticket. And then when he attempted to enter the train, he was immediately arrested. He wanted to strike down these segregated train cars. Did it work? What was the statement of law? 3 words. Separate. Go ahead.
Separate but equal.
Separate but equal was the statement of law. Supreme Court looked at this and they said these train cars are basically the exact same train cars. Same size, same seats, same windows, same restroom facilities. They said it is perfectly legal to separate as long as the separation or the segregation is equal. And these train cars were equal, so this was allowed. Homer Plessy thought, as being a very, very, very light-skinned black man, that in fact he would have an excellent chance of winning. And to be honest with you, it makes sense that he would have, because you wouldn't have necessarily known by looking at him what his race was. But legally, the law said no. Legally, the law said no, separate but equal is the pattern that we're going to go. Doesn't matter how much color or lack of color you have in your skin. The fact is that separate but equal became the standard dealing with racial law in the United States for a good 50, 60, maybe even 70 years. So keep that thought in mind. What else do you have up here? Go ahead.
There's 2 Chapter 5 Word documents. Because one, the question was, what is reverse discrimination? And that's not on this one.
Okay, I'll make sure that I have that fixed. I'll make sure that I have that fixed, or I'll make sure that there's completely different exams. So I'll make sure that we're good. But what question have you got about terms?
Oh, well, it's one of the questions on there, actually.
Okay, what question?
7.
7. What controversial? Don't worry about it.
Okay.
Don't worry about it. What other questions have y'all got? Go ahead.
What is ADA?
Americans with Disabilities Act.
Okay.
Americans with Disabilities Act. And when we dealt with the Americans with Disabilities Act, do y'all remember what we had mentioned about that? What kinds of services were added?
Like ramps and
Ramps, handrails in restrooms, testing center facilities on campuses, these kinds of things, because they didn't always used to be there. And the idea behind ADA, if you remember on this, is basically providing equal opportunity to a group that had traditionally not had it before. I mean, we take for granted the ramps and the handrails and the testing center and a number of these other facilities that are out there. Even some of the little elevator features that are on the public transportation buses now. I mean, this would have kept somebody from being able to pursue a job or pursue education. I think I had read you the quote in there that while this has dramatically changed the American lifestyle, the American landscape even, I think I also mentioned when I read the quote that in fact, I think it was 7 in 10 people with disabilities, in fact, thought that their lives were really not all that changed by these different factors that were there. So it has a little bit of mixed results. What's the minimum width of a store aisle?
3 feet.
3 feet to accommodate wheelchairs. And I told you that story about the man in Pittsburgh that went through with the wheelchairs and broke things in the Pier 1 stores because there were not 3-foot aisles. What other questions have you got? Go ahead, Gizo.
What do you mean by knowing?
Knowing. I had mentioned to y'all, and this was within the context, I think, of Matthew Shepard, but you could also put this within the context of Brown versus Board of Education. In the context of LGBT rights, the chapter says that oftentimes how a person views LGBT rights is dictated by who they know that is actually part of the LGBT community. So if you have experience or if you have exposure or if you have friendships and relationships with people that are LGBT, then in fact you're going to be much more accommodating because you realize that people are people. Doesn't really
A
matter.
person who has a gay friend is more likely to support gay marriage than someone who.
Exactly. And I had mentioned this also within the context of Brown versus Board of Education. Do y'all remember what the lawsuit was in Brown versus Board of Education? Oh, shame. Go ahead.
What do you mean, like, I know that, for example, as opposed to arguing against the equal, he essentially argued that schools that were separate were inherently unequal because they made it so that black students felt inferior
Exactly.
to whites because they were being taken from a school and yeah.
Exactly. And see, the thing of it was, Brown versus Board of Education struck down segregated public schools. I mean, this was really the big win that the NAACP and Thurgood Marshall and a number of other activists had. Well, the trick on this was that as long as you kept the different races separated in different schools, then you didn't know anybody. When they began to come together, and then in fact they began to have contacts, and they began to share classes, and they began to do things athletically or socially or whatever the case may be, then all of a sudden as you began to know people, just like with that example with the LGBT community, it became easier to understand that just because somebody was white or just because somebody was black and you weren't, they were still people just like you were. And that's kind of the point with the knowing. When you have a group that you don't have any exposure to, your mind will get a little irrational, or your mind, being sheltered, your imagination begins to run, or you can be manipulated. As you begin to break down this separation, this lack of experience or exposure, then that begins to go away because you can figure it out on your own. That's what knowing was. Give me another one. Anybody else?
Sexual harassment.
Sexual harassment. I'll be quick with this, and I think we've kind of talked around this in all of the classes, but maybe we didn't exactly address it. Sexual harassment is basically the idea, and this is really the key thing, and I think I've said this in a number of classes. It doesn't matter what you think is right. It doesn't matter what the group thinks is right or wrong. But what matters is what each individual person thinks. So within the context of sexual harassment, I may come up to some people on campus and I might give them a hug. I might see some people on campus and I might exchange different humor than I would with other folks. The idea is that I can't use a defense of saying, oh, I think it's okay, so it's not sexual harassment. I can't say that it's a majority of the class thought it was okay, so it's not sexual harassment. But if one person finds something as being sexually harassing or wrong, then it becomes an issue. So it depends on what each individual person thinks, not what I think, not what the group thinks. And that standard changes from person to person to person. So keep that in mind. What other questions?
Missouri Compromise.
What was the Missouri Compromise?
Missouri wanted to become
Not the 3/5.
a slave state.
Oh,
And
if
then,
I was slave state,
The
we would have
Missouri
a non-slave
Compromise
state.
said that the Union states had to say free states had to have the same amount of slave states. They're to be an equal amount.
No, I think it was that Union states, it has to do with Dred Scott, right? That even if I went to the North and I was a slave in the South, I'm still a slave in the North, even though they're free states. I'm still.
Now that's ultimately kind of what Dred Scott ended up saying.
Right.
There was a number in the Missouri Compromise because you're kind of like popcorn right now. You're all over the place. What was the number?
Isn't it like you have a state that is free, you need to get another one?
You do. But what was the line?
Oh, that's stupid.
36, 30?
Yeah, the Missouri. What's that?
36, 30?
36 degrees, 30 minutes north latitude. The compromise was, with the exception of Missouri, every state that was added above 36 degrees, 30 minutes north latitude, henceforth was going to be a free state. And the states that were added below 36 degrees, 30 minutes north latitude would be slave states. Now, to all of your points, the compromise that they had kind of reached regarding slavery was that every time they would add a free state, they would also add a slave state. Or if you want to look at it in the other direction, every time they added a slave state, they were going to add a free state. Why was that important? Why did you have to keep them
maintain a
equal?
balance in the Senate and the House.
Why?
Because if you have one overriding the other, then everything. Don't put it in my face, bro.
They were afraid that, like, if they had too many slave states, they would just, overwhelm the, free states and pass pro-slave bills, but they were also afraid that if there were too many free states, it would be vice versa.
They needed to keep it tied in the United States Senate. And if they kept it tied in the United States Senate, then the free states could not outvote the slave, but the slave states could not outvote the free. Exactly what
Is
it
it
was.
tied only in the Senate or the House?
Well, you would still be, the Senate was based on equality.
Okay.
So the Senate would be equal because each state would only have 2 senators. The House might have been a little bit different
Okay, so
because
it didn't
it's based
matter.
on population.
The Senate.
It was gonna have to be passed from both the House and the Senate. So they could finagle it to keep the House equal as well, but the Senate was the one that they had to keep equal. And you knew a free state was not gonna elect a slave state senator, and you knew that a slave state was not going to elect a free state mindset for their senator. So that would basically have kept it that way. That was the thing with the Missouri Compromise. It was the Dred Scott case that ultimately was the example where the Supreme Court decided that they wanted to solve slavery once and for all. Do y'all remember what happened in Dred Scott?
He was a slave and his master said, when I die, I will set you free.
Yes.
But they were afraid that if Dred Scott were to go to a free state, he would just be sent back down there because, he needed paperwork. So they decided to pretty much set up a court case where the master's wife would, sue, and she intentionally wanted to lose, so Dred Scott would have a legal paper showing he's free.
That's exactly what it was. Let me stop you right there. So basically, they wanted to set this up, and her thought was, if the Supreme Court says you're a free man, that's going to be better than anything that I could say. And if you look, if you remember, there were the periwinkle states, and then there were the clay-colored states. And if you were in one of those periwinkle states, which I believe were the free states on that map, you could conceivably, if you were along the borders, you could conceivably be kidnapped, taken back into a slave state, and then you're considered a slave state again. Doesn't really matter what the master or the widow would have said. However, if the Supreme Court says, Dred Scott, you're a free man, then at that point, you're a free man, and it doesn't matter where you go because this has got the backing of the United States government behind it. But she did want to lose. It looked like you had more to say.
Well, she wanted to lose, but when he went up, when they actually stood before the Supreme Court, she won. Actually, it didn't go in her favor.
She did. How many minutes is on the camera?
22.
Could you stop it and restart it? Do it at about 15 minutes every time.